The Great Migration is a term that I have thrown around on a bunch of these things, and it's related to the idea that historically, where did people live? And the answer is where they were born, where they went to school, or where they went and got their job. That's basically where people would decide to live for the vast majority of them. And the internet has changed this game because it's decoupled where you make your money from where you live. And suddenly this opens up a whole other universe to people where they can say, okay, well, if I don't have to live where I work, then where do I choose to live?
Mindblowers, uncovering the mysteries of the future. This episode, The Great Migration, with Michael Rosmer, known as the Offshore Citizen, and Daniel Kafer.
Hi, and welcome to Mindblowers. This time we have Michael Rosmer in the studio. Many people know him as the Offshore Citizen, helping people finding more tax-friendly locations, but also talking about lifestyle in different countries. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Great to see you. I've actually seen a lot of your videos. So we are going to talk about many of the topics you already address in your videos, but the angle of it will be slightly different because we're going to talk about it from an futuristic and AI and robotics perspective. But first, Michael, could you tell me a little bit about what is the Great Migration that you're talking about? You can give us maybe a little bit of a historic perspective and what you see in the future.
Sure, yeah. So, the Great Migration is a term that I have thrown around on a bunch of these things, and it's related to the idea that historically, where did people live? And the answer is where they were born, where they went to school, or where they went and got their job. That's basically where people would decide to live for the vast majority of them. And the internet has changed this game because it's decoupled where you make your money from where you live. And suddenly this opens up a whole other universe to people where they can say, okay, well, if I don't have to live where I work, then where do I choose to live? And I think that's probably going to result in the biggest movement of people. I mean, we're already seeing the start of it. The biggest movement of people probably since Christopher Columbus discovered North America. That level of change is probably what you will see incoming. And it will be deeply societally impactful in terms of the restructuring because people are going to choose to go, I think, mostly to places that have better quality of life and lower costs. So, you're from Denmark, I'm from Canada. Weather's not that great in either place. You're in Cyprus. I live a lot of the year in Dubai. There's a tendency that people are going to go from places where the weather is better or worse to where the weather is better. They're going to go from places where it's more expensive to where it's less expensive. Expenses are going to include lots of different factors, right? We see this cost of living crisis. That's a huge political issue across a lot of sort of the Western world today. And so, it's fairly attractive. I was just in Vietnam and Philippines. Well, guess what? Your money goes a lot further in Vietnam and Philippines than it does in some place like Denmark or some place like Norway or some place like Vancouver or Toronto or wherever, right? So people are going to have a tendency to move. We see this with people who are retiring. They say, oh, it's hard to afford to live here. Let me go to Mexico. Let me go to somewhere else that it's easier to get by. And it turns out that at the same time, you have this compounding effect as there's a breakdown in the quality of a lot of these services. So I talk to people, it's kind of an interesting thing. Canadians don't really appreciate how much Canada is no longer that great a place to live, relatively speaking. But I talk to people from India, and you have to understand, for a lot of people coming from India, India has been for a historically long time, the goal for many people has been to move to someplace like Canada. And I'll talk to clients who tell me, oh, I moved to Canada 4 years ago and I'm leaving now. And it's like, wow, you spent years and years of your life working to move here. Now you're leaving. Why are you leaving? And they tell me three things. They say, well, the economic opportunities aren't what they used to be. The cost of living is ridiculous and healthcare sucks. And I was just in Southeast Asia and I ended up injuring my back. And I was thinking about it. I was fortunate I didn't have to have surgery, at least not at this point in time. But I thought, if I'd been in Canada and that happened and I needed a surgery, I would probably have had to wait 6 months. And, if you're in some of these other countries, maybe you have to pay for it, but it's not that expensive. And you can get it today. My brother had some issue where He needed to get some scan of his jaw. And it was 6 months and was going to cost $100 to get this thing done. And just for fun, I was like, let me check and see what it is in Dubai. And the answer was I could walk in tomorrow and I could get it done for $250. And so there's this idea of like, oh, we're paying all these high taxes, but hey, it's justified because we have free healthcare, we have free education, we have all this. It's like, yeah, but your healthcare sucks. And it's not that expensive to go and pay for healthcare in some of these other places. And so does it make sense to be there? My parents, who are retired now, have friends who have gone to Mexico to go and get various health procedures because it's better quality, it's cheaper, they'll get their dental work done there, etc. And so all of these factors are pressuring the movement of people. And something that's, I think, like there's this really common cognitive bias that people have, which is where they fail to update their beliefs. And so if you were to go back to, I don't know, let's say the 70s or the 80s, and you said, well, what are the best places in the world to live? People would say places like Denmark, Canada, United States, etc. And if you were to compare to some place like Malaysia, for example, it was just clearly true that the quality of life was better in these former developed countries than it was in some place like Malaysia. But fast forward to today, quality of life in Kuala Lumpur is arguably as good as almost any of those major cities in these former developed Western countries. And so what's the choice now? Well, now all of a sudden you're like, you know what? I don't need to make the money there. Yeah, the wages are lower, but who cares? I work online anyway. So I can be in a situation where I don't have to worry about it. I can just, go and make my money working for some big company online, or I can be having an online business, or I can be, just some sort of a normal freelancer. I'll sell my services to a Western company and I will pay the cost of living in this other country. I will have lower taxes. I will have healthcare that's actually better. I will be in a situation where the weather is better, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, that pressure, and there's just all these different pieces mounting, are just going to cause a lot of people to move. And when a lot of people move, that's going to have a really dramatic effect on things like the immigration systems, like the tax systems, like the way that we organize services, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is kind of the concept behind the Great Migration.
Do you see changes? I mean, both if you look back like one decade and maybe look one decade ahead about where people are moving. So are some locations becoming more and more attractive and maybe some less attractive?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it's very, very difficult to pay super attention to what's going to happen because of the fact that things can change relatively quickly, right? You see what's happening in Argentina, you see what happened in El Salvador. If you were to go back 10 years, El Salvador was the most dangerous country in the world. And people would have said, this is a terrible place, you're never going to want to go there. Now it's like one of the safest Latin American countries. And, a bunch of people are looking at going there with the tie-in to Bitcoin and things like this. And so, a lot can change in that time. But I would say generally the trend that I see is certainly the Middle East is on the rise. Like they've kind of hit their own stride, their own momentum, and that's probably going to continue. And so this is, primarily UAE, to some extent Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, and Saudi. Those are probably the major ones. Although to be fair, Egypt has improved a lot from what it was even just 6 years ago or something like that. And so there's some interesting things going on there that will likely drive people. Southeast Asia is clearly a place that a lot of people are going to. I mean, I was just in Vietnam and I was talking to some people and they were from Israel. And they were saying, I don't understand why all these young people aren't rising up against communism. And they decided to ask some of them. And they said, oh no, this is new communism and we're very happy. And some people will kind of brush that off and be like, oh, these people are, they're brainwashed. They've been told some story by the state. I don't think that's the case at all. I think what's going on is the economy of Vietnam has gone up by a factor of 10 in the last 20 years. It's the fastest growing economy in Southeast Asia, which basically makes it the fastest growing economy in the world or close to it. And that means there's a lot of economic opportunity for people, and people are happy when there's an economic opportunity. And so as a general rule, these places are getting better. They're getting better fairly quickly. They offer things that other places don't necessarily offer. And so I think that trend of Asia as being a more attractive place to be for a lot of people is probably going to continue. Latin America is like more of a mixed bag. I think it depends where and what they have a lot of violence problems. They have a lot of crime problems in a bunch of there. Tons of people right now really like Mexico. And I think that's probably going to continue to be the case, but you never know. Again, Argentina maybe will manage to turn things around. We'll see. They've been a mess for a very long time. And so I'm a little bit pessimistic on the ability to overcome that, but maybe we'll see. Europe is like a weird one because, so broadly speaking, I think Europe is, if you're reliant on Europe domestically, you're probably in problems. You can just kind of take a look. The share of global GDP that was shared by Europe not very long ago was about 25%. Now it's down below 15%, and that looks to continue. They seem to be convinced that it's the best thing to do is to make themselves the least business-friendly place on the planet, that this is somehow a positive deal. Mario Draghi recently came out with some report on European competitiveness, which was quite scathing, but I think his solutions are more of the top-down, centralized type approaches that caused the problem to begin with. And so I don't see that getting them out of it. But at the same time, the quality of life in places like Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, etc., is pretty high, right? It's people like living there. And so I think probably, it's going to be like a mix of all these different trends. And some of those trends are weather driven. Some of them are, a certain culture driven. Some of them are going to be taxation driven or cost driven. So I just think that in general, the pressure will be away from countries with bad weather on average and away from high cost countries to low cost. That will probably be like the general move. And then there's a lot of different dimensions that is across. Obviously, safety is another one, right? Like, people are, if you don't have safety, you don't have much. And so people are probably not going to go to, I don't know, you can see people leaving South Africa, for example. There's lots to like about South Africa, but the problems in South Africa are pretty significant. So that would be just sort of a general viewpoint.
Would you be able to offer like a top 3, for example, on the conditions that if a family had, let's say, 100,000 euros to spend every year, so that could be from investment or it could be from online work, and it was important to have like decent safety, decent education, for example, and nice weather. Like, what would your top 3 be?
It's really tough to try and generalize. Like I always tell people, there's no one size fits all. The idea of giving diagnosis without or treatment without diagnosis is malpractice, and so so much of it is very it's very values driven, right? So I have some clients and friends who say, hey, listen, we don't like the places that are popular. We want the places that are off the beaten track. So I know people who are going to Nicaragua. I can tell you most people are not going to Nicaragua. Most people kind of consider it to be too far off the beaten track. I could tell you that, hey, well, Malaysia is pretty good across a bunch of the vectors that you're looking at, and a bunch of people might like to go there. But for some people, Malaysia is a little boring. If you have kids and you have to put kids in private schools, then the costs rise a lot. And so that changes the calculus quite a bit for you as compared with, if you can be in some place where your kids can have school for cheaper. And so that's something that's worth considering. Then it depends on the type of job that you have, your ease of immigration. Like if you're somebody coming from India, you're probably not going to be so excited to move to Malaysia because it's maybe a little bit similar, but you might have a hard time moving to, the US, for example, because it's just difficult to get visas. If you're coming from Denmark, Sweden, something like that, it's easy to go anywhere in the EU. And so the Eastern Europe, Cyprus, Spain, Portugal, places like this become pretty attractive for a lot of people. But yeah, it's really, really difficult to generalize. And I don't think that people should kind of take that sort of generalized approach. I think they should probably get really personal, and they should go and they should take some trips and check some of these places out. A good friend of mine who just moved to Spain, he's American, mentioned to me the other day that he thinks it takes 6 weeks to figure out whether you can say no to a place or not. And so you probably need to spend some time there. You probably need to see what it's like. And based on that, you can decide, all right, here's, this place is a place that could work for me. So yeah, just everyone's different.
So looking at the trend of the Great Migration, do you see it as an accelerating trend or do you think it's just like continuous?
Obviously, at some point in time, it will, decelerate. but I think we're very early in it. I mean, if you think, I don't know about you, but for me, I started doing things sort of online, remote, etc., somewhere around 2008, 2010, like somewhere in that range. And it really, like, you required smartphones basically, right? I have a very distinct memory where I hadn't wanted to get a BlackBerry. And I was out at a party somewhere, and there was something about a meeting the next day, and I had to go home to my apartment to send an email in order to confirm this appointment for the next day. And that was the day I told myself, I'm going to go and buy a BlackBerry because I don't want to have this inconvenience. And then obviously iPhones came, and these other things, etc. And so now it's become pretty practical. I kind of would talk about how in 2019, I think it was, The Economist had said that by 2030, there'd be 1 billion location independent workers. Then you had COVID happen, and COVID was this huge accelerant, right? All of a sudden, all these people were forced to work remotely. And so companies put systems in place. People got used to being on Zoom, all these tools got developed, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that for most people, that whole idea is pretty new. And they're going to gradually become more and more familiar with it. They'll see their friends. There's a lot of little problems that exist because, you move away from your people, and then you don't know people there. And how do you get immersed in a society? One of the things that I think is like super fascinating is how historically we had religion, right? And I think there's like this really, I like to kind of like flip a lot of commonly held ideas. And so this really popular thing over the last while has been this idea of, you ask somebody like, what religion are you on? People say, well, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And there was kind of this idea that religion is bad and spirituality is good. And I'm like, well, maybe it's the opposite, actually. Maybe it's that spirituality is bad and religion is good. And, that's like a thing you can play around with. But one of the reasons I say that is just because when you came into a new community, people would go to church once a week or something. You'd go to the church and you had a community where you'd meet people, you'd build relationships, et cetera. People don't really go to church anymore today, or at least a large part they don't. And so how do they get that tight-knit community? We've got some really interesting projects. Like I was just at the Network State Convention in Singapore with Balaji. And so they're doing things like these pop-up cities. Well, this is super cool. They go to some area, like they did one, the founder of Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin, did Zuzulu in Montenegro for 2 or 3 months or something. There's been one they did in California. They've got something, Juan, the founder of Filecoin and IPFS, is doing some stuff in Argentina. You've got like a bunch of these different where they're getting together groups of kind of like-minded people. They're setting up this small little city environment. They build these communities. They test latest biohacking stuff. They're busy doing classes to share with each other. They incubate different startups or different pieces of software, et cetera. Like these are super interesting, very, very cool concepts to try and get around some of the problems that are sort of inherent with this, I guess, location independent, relocate around the world, great migration culture that you're talking about. So we're very early in that. I suspect that there will be new software tools that will be developed. There will be new different communities. There will be, different like physical locations that pop up. There will be models for how to run those. There will probably become some sort of politics systems around them. Maybe you use that to bootstrap different sort of currencies between places. Who knows what exactly you do? I think that as we get more and more of those, you will see it will become more and more palatable to more and more people. And they'll start to take the plunge. Like I was mentioning with the thing with education. I mean, there's a group, I think it's called like Boundless or something. A friend of mine's kids are in it. Very cool kind of for these globally minded families to put their kids in and, go and live in some other part of the world and have their kids experience with other people in this regard. And this thing has grown super fast, but like it's fairly expensive still. And so you kind of think, well, for people who are going to be leaving someplace like Denmark or UK or Australia or New Zealand, where they're used to having education paid for, and they're going to come into this other situation, well, what are the alternatives? Well, somebody's got to come up with a fairly cost-effective education system, which should be really viable because the cost of everything information-oriented pretty much has collapsed over the last few decades, except for education, which its prices have just skyrocketed. There will be innovation in those fields. One of the things that's really, really cool that I've been playing around with lately is the combination of YouTube and Chat GPT as a learning tool. Like, this just feels like such an enormous hack your ability to pick up concepts, or at least my ability to pick up concepts way quicker, is phenomenal compared to like a traditional classroom setting, let alone books, right? If you were to go and pick up a book and you try to learn that way, compared to having a conversation with Chat GPT where, something's too complicated, you say, explain that to me more simply, and it does. You have some little word that you don't know, like, well, what's that word? What does that mean? And then it goes and you can dive into whatever little thread you want. Then you can go to YouTube videos and you can watch videos where people explain that concept visually in this dynamic way that's really engaging. And then you have something there that you don't understand. So you ask ChatGPT about it and it kind of feeds into itself. It's this really, really awesome iterative learning cycle that is probably going to be super transformational and costs next to nothing. So, why shouldn't that be accessible at scale in some sort of a properly structured way, such that, families can say, okay, it's going to cost me, say it costs you, I don't know, $1,000 a year or something for a student to be in class. That seems very, very reasonable to me.